Hey, it's Lawrence Sanders Jr. This is week number 2. Thank you for joining us on We the People, Be the People, where it is a call to action, a call to change. Thank y'all for joining me. I'm your host. I am Lawrence Sanders once again. If you are driving, please stay focused on the road, keep your eyes and hands on the wheel. And for those who are at home, thank you for joining me. It's so good to have you guys here. Super grateful to be on the network, the TFG network. Here, be the people, y'all, where this is a call to action. This is a call to change. And we'll just kind of go through and we'll recap what we talked about last week. And we talked about political enlightenment. And basically, that was we're talking about awareness. We have to educate ourselves. We have to be aware. We have to know what's going on around us within our climate. We have to know what is happening, who's on the ballot. Which, by the way, shout out to all those who voted. 7 o'clock. The polls are closed now. But shout out to those who used their voice and actually voted in these locals elections, especially here in Dallas. But we're talking about political enlightenment. Knowing what's going on, what's happening around us, knowing who is what, being educated on how the system works, what is the system. And then we also talked about political engagement, which basically once we have educated ourselves, what do we do with that information? What do we do with that knowledge? Knowledge is such a strong weapon that we have. Yet it's like, how do we use that to further the change that we want to see? That's a part of being the people. And then thirdly, once we know what's going on, once we act, that leads to political evolution. And that's basically the advancement for the things that we want. As we act, as we are proactive, because we talked about being proactive, reactive, and radioactive. If you don't know what that is, go back and watch the previous episode. We start to see evolution in our cities, in our neighborhoods, in our states, in our country, ultimately. So again, we're here ultimately for political advancement, but it starts with education. And then once we know, then we act. So be the people is just that. It's a call to action. Thank you guys for joining me. Today's episode number 2. Y'all know what we about. Y'all know what we doing, how we get down. So the question is, how do we get here? How do we get to the United States of America with these different governments? How did this happen? Glad you asked. If you joining me, hey, join some pen, get some paper. We got some trivia this episode. We got some facts. We got a little bit of history. But this episode, we're going to talk about the United States government. And now we're not going to get too in depth, not going to get into too many details because this is a really long rabbit hole. But we're going to talk about the basic fundamentals of American government and our history. So one of the first things is just what government is in its simplest form. Government is basically a system to govern a state or a community. Basically, that's it. It's whatever system that is put into place to govern. That means to give rules and enforce those rules, whether it be taxes, which we'll talk about later. But the simplistic form or definition of what government is, by just a regular Webster's definition, it's just a system to govern a state or a community. It's that simple. That's all government is. It's nothing. I mean, there are deeper definitions, but in a nutshell, again, we trying to make this real easy so we can all understand. So these forms of government historically has usually came in 2 forms. Y'all ready? The first form is considered electoral contest, which is our form of government. So you have basically a vote off. We go to the polls, we have our favorite, we cast our vote, and that's who wins. The other one is considered hereditary succession, which basically we have a lot of monarchies and oligarchies, and we'll get into that form of government. And basically how that works is you have a small family who over time, the governmental powers are passed from Queen Elizabeth I to the 2nd to the 3rd to the 4th and to the 25th to the Queen Elizabeth the 30th. Those are the 2 primary forms of government that we're seeing, that we have seen. All right. So Got your pen and your paper? Here we go. We're going to break down just some of the different forms of government. The first one is the aristocracy, which basically the ideology is it's ruled by the best, which this was founded by Aristotle, which basically is based on those who are wealthy or those who have land. Basically, the people that they call aristocrats. So these are your wealthy, as they would call nobles, your kings, those who had money and those who had influence. Those are going to be the people who had influence and who ran the governments in the aristocracy. So an example of that, though, which was oddly enough not surprising, an example of this would have been the Roman Catholic Church back in the gap. It was wrong. It was ran by those who had power, who had money, who had authority. They were the ones who basically ran the government. The next one is going to be monarchies. And this one, again, is another form of hereditary succession, which basically mean they're ruled by a king or they're ruled by a queen. And I'm just kind of like, I took some notes down. It says throughout most of history, the monarch's powers were absolute. So outside of them, there was nobody else. Didn't care what you said. If you disagreed, off with his head, he could go. That was a wrap. That's in a nutshell how monarchies ran. More so now, though, we see something called constitutional monarchies, which basically the government has a constitution that the monarchs kind of abide by now. It's not absolute where, like, if you disagree, then it's like, oh, well, he could die. Well, no, is the disagreement based on the constitution that was set up, within that culture, within that society. For example, the United Kingdom, Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden is another one. Examples of monarchies. The next one is going to be oligarchy, which is basically it's ruled by the few. Now, if you're following me and you hear this definition, it may remind you kind of sort of a common place that we may know about. So the oligarchy is ruled by the few, and that often means usually the rich, right? It says billionaires donate huge sums to candidates that are usually rewarded by the passage of favorable legislation. Example, Russia, China, Iran, and it may actually sound like the United States, right? Because we have something called lobbyists who own these companies and they have billions of dollars. And what do? They pay exorbitant amount of money to get certain legislation passed, to have certain political influence within the government. Absolutely. I'm with you, Kanara. Hey, welcome, man. Thanks for hanging out. So the oligarchy is really is a bunch of rich guys who basically control the government. So it's not so much the people who were set up. It's just like, yo, I'm a billionaire. I need this to pass. So we have something called lobbyists, and I'm sure this is something else that you've probably heard during, election time. You hear the phrase or you hear the term lobbyist, right? So the simple definition of a lobbyist is basically someone who takes part in an organized attempt to influence legislation. It's bribery, basically. I mean, in a nutshell, it's bribery. And this has kind of been the history of the United States. And I know we're still on oligarchy, but there are similarities between an oligarch type government and a democracy, which we'll get to next. But lobbyists basically are the ones who use their money and they push agendas. They push certain agendas because they have money, i.e. this last election. I mean, not to scrape up anything, but in my opinion, I feel like the Electoral College was influenced by lobbyists. Yo, we need Donald Trump to be president, and this is how we gonna do it. Because again, we know factually Hillary won the popular vote. And again, I'm not for either candidate, but based on our system of government, we have the Electoral College that is supposed to cast ballots and cast votes based on what their district voted on or what their area or segment voted on. But when you have lobbyists in an oligarch type government, those with money have the ability to influence how the government runs. And it's usually a mess, but that's neither here nor there. And so now we get to the United States form of government. And I got a lot of information. I'm gonna move fast. If you want to come back and watch it, please come back and watch it to take notes. We have the democracy, we the people, right? The democracy is basically it's ruled by the people themselves through their representatives. Just some notes that I had took down. Many believe that representatives do not always act in the interest of the people that they represent. We just talked about that. For instance, in the United States, elected representatives often pass legislation that overwhelmingly benefit the affluent class or corporations. Now you can see how the oligarchy and the democracy, like they have similarities. One just says, yo, the few are going to rule and be influenced, as opposed to the democracy says, okay, we're going to be ruled by the people, but we're still going to be influenced by those with money. All right, y'all still with me? Okay, cool. I know y'all still with me. All right. So the problem with the modern day democracy, though, is we have an issue with this low voter turnout situation. This is what's killing the democracy, because people are not showing up to the polls to voice where they are. They're not voting for their representative. This is why, again, I say there's so much power in voting, because when you show up to the polls, it says, this is who I give my support to. This is who I agree with. This is who I want to write the laws for me. This is who I identify with when it comes to certain policies and procedures. And so when we show up and we place our vote, and again, we talked about last week how the Supreme Court, now there's a penalty for the faithless voters in the Electoral College, which is now how it should have been. Exactly. It's supposed to be ruled by exactly. Yeah, exactly. We're supposed to be represented by those in the Electoral College, but it's been proven over time that hasn't been the case. So now the Supreme Court has to go back and say, oh, well, wait. Okay, now we have to add penalties because this is a thing. And we'll learn as we continue to go through this thing that our government has a tendency to go back and be like, oh, our bad. Let's go ahead and add this because we didn't think about this issue when we wrote it initially. We didn't think this was going to be a thing. And that's happened a few times once we start getting into the Constitution and we get into the 27 amendments. There are 27 amendments to the original 7. It's crazy, but we'll get into it later. All right, I digress. So, in your opinion, just drop real quick in the comments. Let me know, what does our government, the United States, identify as, in your opinion? Based on kind of what we've just talked about, the democracy, the oligarchy. I know the republic, which is kind of the same as the democracy. It's just the republic is just making everything public, which we know, again, that's a lie, but the people still have a say in the government. So real quick, drop some comments. Let me know, what do you think our government as the United States identifies as? So with that being said, y'all go ahead and we'll weigh in. So I want to talk about the two primary governments that we have here in the United States. The two primary that we really have is the democracy. One is the democracy, and I'll go into more details about what the democracy looks like. So the democracy is a system of government where the citizens exercise power by voting. Now, there are different kinds of democracies. There's a direct democracy, and then there's a representative democracy, and then there's a constitutional democracy. There's so many democracies. It would make sense just to have one, and they all meant the same thing. Unfortunately, it's never really black and white like that. No pun intended. Sorry. So in a direct democracy, the citizens as a whole form a governing body and vote directly on each issue. It's pretty self-explanatory. A representative democracy, the citizens elect representatives from among themselves. And that's something where we, being the people, can really benefit from. I talked in the last episode is that we have to be able to first educate ourselves. And in educating ourselves, we have to know, that tells us what it is that we want. What do we want our communities to look like? What do we need our legislation to look like? Who are we letting into our communities? Who can invest into our communities? Like, what is the penalty for not allowing certain people to invest in the community? And so with that, we have to know what it is that we want within our community. And then we have to find somebody to basically give that ideology, or to vet that shares that same ideology with us. So we find, Steve, that just graduated from Dallas County Community College and has aspirations to go to SMU, but he wants to get into politics. But he believes that, no, we should have this, and this. And he's willing to fight for that. He's willing to represent us. Good answer, Kendrick. Absolutely. It has similarities. It definitely has similarities. But in a representative democracy, there's somebody that represents me, that has my ideology, that I send to make things happen and to make things change on my behalf. And that goes back to the political evolution. Now that we know what we want, we're acting. We've gave this person our vote. We've gave them our support. We've given them our money. We financed their campaigns. We've knocked on doors. And now we're pushing this person because we believe in them, because they share our ideology, not because of what party they're with. Whether it be Republican or Democrat, it doesn't matter. They share my ideology. And you will be surprised how some of us, we say we're Democrat, but then we start going down the list of what do you believe in and what do you identify as? And then we're like, oh, well, you may be like a liberal Republican, excuse me. So a representative democracy, in my opinion, could be idealistic, especially for where we are. Right. And then we have a constitutional democracy. The powers of the majority are exercised within the framework of a representative democracy. Right. Which is what we just talked about. Usually through the enjoyment of all by certain individual rights, which is the Constitution. So we should have a constitutional representative democracy, because that is a government that is based on the Constitution, right? That believes that we have a representative that we send that enacts mosh pit of all of them. Of course, Brenton. That we send on our behalf. So that's the democracy. Next, we have a republic, right? So I'm sure you heard the Democratic Republic of America. Some people say Democratic Republic of Texas, whatever. A republic is a form of government in which the country is considered a public matter, not the private concern of the property of rulers, and where offices of state are subsequently direct or indirectly elected or appointed rather than inherited. So that means none of this oligarch, monarchy type stuff. The people that we put in office are the people that we vote for. And we have access and we know what's going down. Right? So basically the head of state is not going to be a monarch. It is going to be an elected official that we as a country, we as a nation, we vote for these people and we put them in office. That's pretty much the two types of government that we have present in the United States. And I say that technically, but we know based on what we see, what we've read historically, it's a mosh pit of all of it. It is oligarchy, republic, Democrat. Like, it's just a combination of so many things that we've experienced here in our nation. But what we have to know, and the takeaway from all of this is, because we are democracy, that gives us power. Because we do have a constitution, that gives us authority. And the Constitution is the fundamental principle by which we have these rights and we have this authority. And we have to know this, because if we don't know this, again, we can be taken advantage of. If we don't know what the Constitution says and what rights we do have, we can be taken advantage of. And for a long time, we have been taken advantage of. And again, I don't want to beat this dead horse, which is why we're here. We're here to educate ourselves on the powers that we have. It's like we're all sleeping superheroes. And once we realize the abilities and the strengths that we have, like we can really make change. And that's what we're about. We're about political evolution. We're about the advancement, not just for us, but for our kids, and their kids. The U.S. is a federation and a republic, a union of partially self-governing states under central, not a straight democracy. Again, I've heard that before, but because what we see so consistently throughout our government, like, it never seems to be one thing. It never seems to be one thing. And I feel like the founding fathers, their intentions were, okay, this is what we wanted to look like. But they weren't, they weren't future tellers. They wouldn't be able to know and be able to tell that 200 years from now that this is what the government would look like, right? Okay, so I don't want to stay on that point too long. So basically, in a democratic republic, we have a say in the government that basically has been made public, right? Our laws are public, our participation process is public. And so with that, like there's something that we have to do. Like there is a part that we have to play, and this is a part of being the people. There is a part that we have to do within our democracy. But again, like I said, so if this is our democracy or we are the democratic republic, how are we able to do this? What enables us to do this? How are we able to get this done? Will you talk about this blah 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 till you blue in the face, and it doesn't make sense to me. Well, okay, we're gonna talk about the Constitution in a minute, but before we get to that, I have a quick question for you to all my government people out there. And mind you, I'm no political scientist or anything like that. It's something that I love to do. What was the governing document prior to the Constitution? Because you have to know, after we left our beloved I want to say oppressors, and I say we, but I mean it wasn't necessarily us, but there was a document that the founding fathers argued over and basically was put into play before the United States Constitution. Anybody know? We'll give us some time to think about it. There was a document that was put into play that was the governing document that gave the 13 colonies at the time, the 13 states. It was their governing document for their governing body. Well, what was that? Somebody drop a comment if you know. I give us like 5 more seconds. There was a government document that existed before the Constitution. Absolutely, Paul. It was the Articles of Confederation. That is correct, which was signed and put into play in 1777. So you have to know the Declaration of Independence was 1776. And so these guys like argued and debated like, yo, this is what we need. This is what we need. And blah, 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 blah. And so there were these Articles of Confederation. There were Articles of Confederation. And so basically the Articles of Confederation was basically, it was an agreement among the 13, they were called original states, but more like they were colonies still, whatever. But it had issues. It had a bunch of issues, and this is why I said earlier in the dialogue is that there are so many things that the United States government saw where it was just kind of like, dang, man, we messed up. That's not gonna work. In the moment, it was a good idea, but it didn't work. So the Articles of Confederation was jacked up because it gave no central leadership. So there was no executive branch. There was no president, right? So they had no ways of implementing laws. They had no ways of like enforcing like any kind of legislative action. They couldn't do it because they didn't have that branch. So also there was no national court system. There was no judicial branch. And for those who are following, you can kind of see where this is going, right? Why we needed the Constitution, because like how are we going to weigh in on things? To how are we going to resolve disputes? And there's no judicial branch between states and territory and people and all this other stuff. And then also, it was crazy because in order to pass laws, you needed at least the approval of 9 states. So you had to get at least 9 states. I'm sorry, I take that back. You needed all 13 states to agree in the Articles of Confederation. So you had to get 13 states to agree on this one piece of legislation before it passed. Now you tell me how difficult that is. That seemed almost impossible. It didn't work out ultimately. And then also it's like the national government, like they didn't have no army. So like in this time, like if Spain wanted to come over and take these 13 colonies, who gonna protect us? The only way that they could do that, they had to solicit like, hey, y'all, we need some folk. Y'all got some people? Nah, we ain't got none. We don't believe in that cause. So the Articles of Confederation was an attempt But as time progressed, as the nation grew, it was like, okay, we need something else. And so it had to be changed. And so then comes the US Constitution, right? So real quick, what date was the US Constitution signed? Somebody drop it real quick. The US Constitution date was signed when? I told you, bring some pen, bring some paper, man. We taking notes today. These are basically the origins of our nation. Real quick, I give us like 5 more seconds. And the question is, what date was the Constitution signed? And the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are two different things. So the answer is not 1776. All right, time's up. So, because we got some Google experts too that are on this. So the Constitution was signed in 1787. And it was signed in Philadelphia. I went to Philly actually it was just last year, man. And it was really cool. I went to Boston and it was able to see both places was really cool. Really cool places just to see our just to see the origins of where a lot of this came from. And basically, so real quick in a nutshell, we're not gonna get into the Constitution too much because that's gonna be next episode, and we're gonna break it down. The Constitution, basically, it is the supreme law of the United States. Everything is governed by the U.S. Constitution. All the power, all the limitations of government, all the fundamental rights of you as a citizen, you as a person, we as the people, comes through the U.S. Constitution. So if we want to know how much power we have, then we got to dive into the U.S. Constitution. That's what we got to do. We have to know what this document says. And again, I don't want to be the dead horse, but we lose because we don't know what the Constitution says. So in a nutshell, the framework of the Constitution, and this is just the intro to next week's episode, the Constitution is constructed of 3 parts. We have the preamble, we have the articles, and then we have the amendments. There are 7 articles, there are 27 amendments. And what we'll do, we'll start to basically break down what that Constitution looks like. We'll look at what happened in some of the amendments, what caused for some of these amendments to come to be, because an amendment is just that. It's something that was amended. It had to be changed. So we'll look at like, why did this happen? And then how does that affect me? Especially 13, 14, and 15 as African Americans. So real quick before we get out of here, I know we got a few more minutes left. We got every day I try to do a daily take, and something really interesting and really cool happened. Once again, the Supreme Court is on it. They are on it. And so long story short, the Supreme Court it rules that half of Oklahoma is Native American land. Whoa. Hey, Lamar, what's going on, man? I hope so. So real quick, I read an article that was shared by NPR, and it said the Supreme Court ruled, which was last Thursday, that about half of the land in Oklahoma is within Native American reservation. So what does that mean? So what that means is we have to know that I hate calling them Indian, like they're Native Americans, like they're not Indian. For those who want to be correct and not even politically correct, they are Native Americans. They're not Indian people. They're not from India. They're Native American. They were given the name Indians out of ignorance. They're not Indian. They're Native American. Like they were here, like they were here before Columbus got here. But we won't get into that. Sorry. So basically what that means, like how crimes are processed and prosecuted now is different. Like it goes before a federal judge now. Anytime something happens, it goes before like a federal judge. One of the quotes that I saw that was really interesting, it says for Indian people, for Native Americans, their land is really important and treaties are important. They are sacred, and this reaffirms the sacredness of the promise of those treaties. So you have to know, like the United States made these treaties years ago, And then of course, like they renege on this stuff, like, oh no, we need this for this. But now the Supreme Court, which is an amazing thing to see, says no, like the majority of this land, the majority of this land belongs to Native Americans. This is y'all's land. And so how y'all decide to do business or to run government, it's up to y'all. It says now and then there's a great case that helps you keep the faith about the rule of law, he said. And this is one of the Chickasaw natives. And so I wanted to talk about this real quick because we got to get out of here. It's just amazing to see how the justice system, it is starting to work. It's starting to work. It's happening. We do, as crazy as it sounds, we have to continue to have faith and trust the system. Although it does fail us most of the time. It does fail us. But I want to share light on the things that are happening that are positive. Things that are happening. There are changes that are happening around us that we may not see. So thank y'all for joining me. Leave some comments, share the episode. Thank you for tuning in to Be the People. Like it, tell your mama, tell your auntie, share it. And until next week, remember, we are the people, but we also got to be the people. I love y'all. See y'all next week. Peace.